Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session of our Azure Administrative Studies series. Hello, Sir David. How are you doing?
Hey, hello, doing good, thanks, doing good, doing good.
It's
So,
been a
man,
lovely day
yeah,
outside.
busy, hot, crazy. Like, I have a fan just sitting right next to me over here that I've been trying to get some hair, but still, it's just crazy. I think
Yeah,
I have the door open, the window open,
yeah, same
but
here.
yeah,
I think for this year, everything seems to be quite extreme. I mean, if you watch the news, you hear a lot of bad stuff happening, like hurricane messing up places, hot temperature, fire burns, and stuff like that. It's just crazy nowadays.
do you think that is because it's like really, really getting worse, or is it because we're able to pay more attention? Do you think that's the reason?
Well,
I
yeah,
don't-
I think yeah, that probably might be the case as well. I think right now because now most people are working from home, you are more
Mhm.
likely to tune in on these things. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and it's also like you said, like people working from home. That's a whole different ball game in itself, right? Just a
yeah,
whole
that's
different ball game with people working from home. And it seems as if like what's going to happen is it's going to probably be the norm for like majority of jobs to work from home going forward,
right.
right? I know that people are probably going, yeah, it's going to be like the norm, but that's going to change a lot of things, right? So
That's
you'll
right.
probably change a lot of things with like working hours. So like people being able to like specify working hours that suits them, right? So again, it will be interesting. We'll see what happens. We'll see
Yeah,
what happens.
I think that's the future. I mean, the way the trend is going, it makes sense anyway. Because
Yeah.
obviously, you just think about it this way, right? Let's say 15 years ago, right?
Mhm.
Then the evolution to or the transition to working from home will not be that smooth,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
Because there wasn't a lot of like internet connection. The bandwidth was extremely small, and
Yep.
now data is literally, I mean, nothing. I mean,
Mm.
so work it make it possible to obviously work from home, and
Mm.
and also obviously many services are now moving to the cloud. So
Mm.
it makes sense that as time goes by,
Mm.
this was what it's going to be.
Yep.
Probably it will be normal for people to just, I mean, work from home. Many companies will just do it.
Yep. And it's also interesting because I'm not sure like how data, because there's still certain areas of the world where data is still like
That's true.
not the
But this
best.
will actually push for the drive to obviously improve those services.
Mm. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And so people are like, yeah, like because providers will go, there's a lot of money
Yeah,
that we can make here.
exactly.
We have to get things
That's how it
good
is.
for
I mean,
people.
to make money, you have to provide services. So you
Yep.
serve the people what the
Yep.
demands.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think that's how it's going to be anyway. 'Cause you
Yep.
just have to think about it. In Ghana, mobile internet probably wasn't as crazy. Mobile, let's say banking, wasn't as crazy until now, right?
Yep.
10 years ago, I mean, who cares about mobile banking? But
Yep.
now, I mean, it's a prerequisite. Every
Yep.
bank that you join, you expect that they have that functionality. So,
Yep.
and I mean, that's the norm, and it will get to a point whereby uh, the same thing. The internet will be much dominant in those countries as well.
Yep. Yeah. It's an interesting one.
Mm.
Okay. So Coffee, what we're going to do. So first of all, we couldn't do yesterday. So we mentioned
Yeah,
that already, ladies and gentlemen. So for those that are joining us live and for those that will be watching the recording, so Sakofi and myself, we really, are doing our best to try to get quality information out to the community and to help with the community. But we also have like normal lives. So we have at least I have a wife. Sakofi has a wife. Sakofi has Akwasi, who is like he's already an IT guy in his own right. He does business, he sells gold, he does all kinds of stuff. So it's already multitasking from a
yeah,
young age. So we have like demands of normal life, and that also comes into play sometimes. So unfortunately, that leads to a few events being cancelled and all that stuff. So the good thing again is that we have a few people that are beginning to volunteer to take on some of this delivery, and then we have some people that will be taking like a day next week and a day the other week and all the other stuff. So today, Sakofi, we're going to be looking at designing serverless Azure Compute solutions. So designing serverless Azure Compute solutions. And when we talk about serverless in Azure, what typically comes to your mind, Sakofi, when we talk about serverless?
When we talk about serverless, well, the only thing that comes to my mind is that no server to worry about. It's just magic.
Yep.
Automatically, your web apps or whatever, all of them will be served to you, and don't have to worry about touching any server.
Hmm.
So all you care about is that wherever the apps or whatever your service that you're trying to deliver, that's all you
Yep.
care about.
Yep. And in Azure, we have a few services that can fall into those that category, right? Of serverless services in Azure,
Yeah.
serverless compute services. So, for example, the other time we're talking about container services in Azure. There is a service in Azure called Azure Container Instance, right? So, Azure Container Instance um, allows us to run containers without having to worry about the underlying infrastructure, right? So then we have other services like Azure Functions. But here's a sort of like a trivia for you, Sakofi. So which of these three cloud providers do you think started the, had the first serverless service? Was
I'll,
it AWS? Was it Azure? Was it Google? Which of the three? What do you think?
because I know about Kubernetes, obviously being came from Google, I'll probably say Google as well.
You're
I'm
absolutely right with
zooming.
that.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right with that. So
All right.
Google
Yeah.
had a service called Google App Engine, and that sort of like so that was in all the way in 2008, right? So because what happens with a lot of these organizations use these services internally for a long time, right? Same with Kubernetes, right?
Yeah.
And then eventually, they essentially made it available to the rest of the world, right? So Google started with Google App Engine in 2008. Then AWS or Amazon launched a similar service called Lambda in 2015, and then thereafter Azure launched their own just a few moments after. So that's sort of like the way that that's
Yeah.
been set
I
up.
mean, it makes sense. If you work flawless for you in your internal organization, obviously other people might need the same service, and
Yeah,
that's a very good business move. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So talk about Azure Functions today. So and the first thing I want to mention about Azure Function is look at this definition. I like this definition, Sir Kofi. So this is a definition. So part of it is like from Microsoft document. Part of it I added. It says Azure Function Hub. It's a service for running small pieces of code in the cloud, right? And that's very important. Oh, sorry, apologies, Sakofi. I think I'm sharing the wrong one, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yep,
You're
I think.
sharing the.
Yeah,
Uh,
sorry.
I thought
Let me go ahead and switch that. So let's go ahead and swap that. Yeah, that's better. That's
yeah.
better. So Azure Function App, it's a service for running small pieces of code in the cloud. But there's a very important part here. So number one is that this service is designed not to run monolithic applications, right? Monolithic applications. So essentially, it's designed to run what we call microservices, right? And Sakofi, so I'll be putting you because on the spot a little bit today.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
but you can handle it. You're the gold man. You're a rich man already, and
I
all this
will
stuff.
actually try to offload it to someone else.
So we have
Outsource it.
micros. Yeah, exactly. So we have microservices. So microservices, right? They allow us to run small pieces of code, right? So instead of me bundling everything together, I can break my application down into smaller components,
Yeah.
right? And then that allows me to be able to develop more quicker. So that's what Azure Functions allowed us to do. It allows us to run small pieces of code in the cloud. Now, this other part is also important, Sakofi, because this other part is saying Azure Function Hub as a service is actually an extension of a service called Azure Hub Service. So there's a little bit of history here, Sakofi. So in Azure Hub Service, there's a particular capability called Web Jobs. Have you heard of web jobs before? I think
No,
I've talked
this is
about
the
it
first
before.
time. No.
Yeah. So there's a particular capability called web jobs. So right now you can't deploy it directly to Azure App Service from the portal. You have to deploy it from source control. But what web jobs allows us to do is to run background tasks in Azure App Service. So that is what web jobs allows us to do. So let me go ahead and bring up this screen, and let's go to bring this up. So just go check out Azure Web Jobs. Azure Web Jobs. So you can see that Azure Web Jobs allows us to run background tasks in Azure App Service, right? So we won't go through all of this, but that is what this is about. So Azure Function is actually an evolution of Azure Web Jobs,
Oh, I
right?
see.
Yeah. So because this allows people to run background tasks for their application. So essentially, you have some tasks that you want to run on a schedule, right? So essentially, maybe your web application is accepting images from users, and then you want to do some batch processing of those images in the background, right? You can use something like a web job to say, 5 p.m. every day, take all these images that are stored over here and process them, right? So you can use web jobs for that. But
But what
then,
about
yeah.
Azure Badge?
Oh, okay. Very good question, Sir Kofi, right?
So I was just
So,
wondering. That's the
yeah.
same thing.
So that's a very, very good point, Sir Kofi. So one of the main differences between Azure Batch and sort of like this type of capability when we're talking about, because when we talk about batching itself, batching is a computing concept, right?
Yeah.
Batching means you're processing together as a group, right?
Yeah.
So, like stream processing. So, for example, when we talk about data, for example, when you're processing data in streams, what that means is you're responding real time to data, right? As data comes in, you're processing it, it's just real time processing. But when we talk about batch processing with data, what that means is that as data is coming in, you're collecting it in a bucket, right? And then at a particular time, you take all those data that you've collected, you process them together. So that's
Okay.
what batching is. So it's a concept that you see across, data processing, across, web applications, across different stuff. You see batching there. So, but one of the differences between batch, Azure Batch Service, and this type of batching that you see in just other, Azure Batch Service is dedicated for what we call high performance compute scenarios, HPC, which is another computing concept. Is that something that that's familiar with HPC, high performance compute?
I
Yeah,
mean, when we talk about the types, yeah, that's when
yeah,
I heard about the
yeah.
high, yeah, those ones, yeah,
So HPC, high performance compute.
few types.
So yeah, let me go HPC, high performance computing. And what HPC essentially means is you're talking about, again, it's the definition is in the name. You're talking about high performance compute scenario, situation that require heavy compute power. So maybe you're doing like a research in a laboratory, and you have some scientific calculations to do,
Yeah,
those kind of scenarios that involves heavy compute, right? So maybe something to do with graphic processing, for example, right?
yeah,
A good use case for something like Azure Batch Service is like graphic processing. So you're collecting images, let's say you're collecting videos, and you want to convert the videos from MP4 to another video format, and you want to do that in batch. So obviously, when you're talking about things that have to do with graphics, you're talking about things that require high compute power. You can schedule those to run in batch across Azure Batch Service, and then you can get it done quicker. So that's one of the differences. I hope that makes sense.
yeah, it does. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So let's go back to what we're talking about. So that is where this came from. So it's sort of like an evolution of web jobs. So Azure Function itself, this is what it looks like, Sir Kofi. So in the background, this is what Azure Function looks like. We have four main components to Azure Functions. It has trigger, the code, the input, and the output. Right? So those are the four main aspects that we control. Everything else we don't control. Right? The underlying infrastructure, the scalability, that's off to the cloud provider to manage that for us. What we control is we control the code that we want to run, right? The input sources for the code, the output destination for the code result, the trigger or the event that's going to execute the code. So that's what we control, right?
So
With
when do you
Azure
get
Function.
charged? So do you get charged when the code is being run, or when it's even at rest? I mean, how does it? How do you Amazon? Sorry, Google, Microsoft? Yeah.
Yeah, so the way so that's a good question, Zakovi. So the way that sort of works in sort of like the charges, so it depends, right? So and we'll get to that in a minute. So it
Right.
depends. So it depends, number one, on the environment that you're running it in, right? So again, we'll see. Have you ever done like I'm not sure whether this happened to you when you're learning CCNA, Zakovi. Like when you did your CCNA, did you move further to like the CCMP series?
No,
When
I
you
did
did
not.
the CCNA years ago. So when I was doing CCNA, I moved a little bit further to like the CCMP series, right?
Yeah.
With CCMP. But also like in your CCNA, you probably remember that. So like you spend like a lot of time learning spanning tree. You remember spanning tree?
Yeah.
Spanning tree protocol.
Yeah. Exactly.
And then only to get like to another chapter and they say, oh, by the way, nobody uses spanning tree.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? There's something called rapid spanning tree, right? That everybody is like, why did you spend a lot of time teaching me spanning tree only to get to chapter 2 and say, by the way, nobody uses that anymore, right? And then when you now get further to CCP, they'll teach you like all this stuff, and then they go further down. They say, by the way, what we told you over there, that's not the complete truth, right? There's a lot more information over here. So it's sort of like the same thing. So, for example, when I said something earlier, when I said these are the only things that you can control in Azure Function, that is not completely true because you can run Azure Function in multiple modes, right? If you run it in the most common mode, then this statement applies. These are the only four things you can control. If you run it in something called the consumption plan mode, but if you run it in something called the dedicated plan mode, you still have relative control over the infrastructure, right? So the answer to that depends on how you're running your Azure function.
So when you say you have control over the infrastructure,
Yeah.
what are we talking about? The compute, or what sort of infrastructure are you in control of?
We'll see that in a minute. So just right in this next slide when we talk about the different plans. Yeah. So we have these four parts to Azure Functions, right? So essentially what we're talking about is we have, let me go very quickly. We have a function hub, and within a function hub, we have our functions, right? We can have multiple functions within a single function hub, right? So, but that's what's hosting our code. And then we have a trigger configured, right? And then we can have, the trigger, in other words, when this event happens, run this code. So that's what the trigger is, right? And the code when it runs can output certain results to an output service. So not just Azure Blob, there are multiple services that we can output into, but it can also receive input or read data from multiple services. So those are the four things areas that makes up Azure Function.
All right. So in
Yeah,
terms of the trigger,
yeah.
is there any specific list of services that can actually, initiate a trigger?
Yeah, very good question, Sir Coffee. So yeah, the answer to that is yes. There is a list, Azure Functions triggers. So Microsoft has a document where they have a list, and where they list what can be used as a trigger, what cannot be used as a trigger. So let me go ahead and bring that up on the screens very quickly. So let's go to that, and let's go to paste this in here. If you have a look at this document, Sarkophie, so it says Azure Function, triggers, and binding concepts. If I scroll down, you see it has a list here for what it calls supported binding, but the main part to focus on for the trigger is this. So, you can use Azure Blob Storage, Cosmos DB. So for Blob Storage, I can say if a new object arrives in a blob container, I want you to run this code to process it. Right? If a new item is stored in a Cosmos DB database collection, I want you to run this. So you have all these different stuff. If a new event registers with Event Grid, or if a new event is streamed, then go ahead and run this. So you can see the different options and what you can use as a trigger, right? It even supports generic things like you can set up like HTTP trigger. So whenever an HTTP request is received, it's going to trigger the code to run. So there's a whole list here of what we can use as triggers.
Yeah. Okay. Before you move on, we got a question from Opemi.
Yes, sir.
He got a question: why is HPC important?
High performance compute. So it's been around for like a long time because again, there's certain applications that. So I'll give you like a very simplified way to put it. So we have different types of laptops, right?
That's
We
right.
have a particular type of laptop that they call gaming laptop, right?
Your
so,
kind, right? The
so
kind that you like.
no, I don't. I'm not a big. You know why it's the gaming laptops
Yeah.
sometimes because I'm not sure where people get this idea that if you're a gamer, you always have to like something that looks a bit. They'll put like a big light at the end, and then it's going to have this curve and it's going to be sharp. I have no idea like why they think that if you're a gamer, you have to like that. So because some of these laptops, when you type in gaming laptops, the design that you see, I'm like, no, this design does not match my personality.
Too flashy.
Yeah, exactly. But Opayemi's question will tie in with that. Why do we need gaming laptops? We need gaming laptops because gaming, as requires, heavy compute. It's the same thing. There are certain applications, maybe scientific calculations,
Data
graphics
analysis.
processing. What did you say, Sakofi? Sorry.
Data analysis.
Yeah, data analysis, right? So there's certain types of applications that requires intensive compute, right? So that is why there's a dedicated area of computing which is high performance compute when you need those sort of capabilities. Okay, so let's move on very quickly. So we understand now just some basic information about Azure Function. Let's go have a quick look at Azure Function, the features that it supports. So let's have a quick look at that, and then we'll look at the hosting plans and to answer Sarkovy's question. So here are the features of Azure Functions. So number one, which languages can we write our code in? So at the moment it supports this language. It supports C Sharp, F Sharp, Node.js, Python,
I
Java,
think
and
you have to
PowerShell.
switch. You have to switch your screen.
Oh, apologies. I need to just swap it. Actually, you know what? Let me go ahead and fix that. Let me go ahead and fix that right now. That's better. So, yeah, you can see my screen now, right?
Yeah,
Better?
you can see it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it supports C Sharp, Node.js, F Sharp, Python, Java, PowerShell. In terms of package management, it supports NuGet, npm, and different package managers. The good thing about Azure Function is that we can also run our microservice. We can run it as code, or we can package it as a container before running it, right? So that's one of the things that you see in many services in Azure. So if I go to, for example, create an Azure Function app just right now. So if I go to Function app, and if I go to create that, so you see that it is going to give me an option to say, do I want to publish my microservice as code, or do I want to publish it as a container? So it always gives us that option. So that's one that Microsoft pushing out more. So it supports both code and containers. So however, just be aware that you can only run your microservice as a container if you're using Linux, not for Windows, right? So we saw the last time that we spoke that there's a lot of limitation for if you're running Windows in Azure Container Instance. It's similar for Azure Function also. So for example, if I go ahead and I say I want Docker container over here, that's going to default to using Linux. So it's not going to be using Windows. If I specify code, if I go to hosting, you can see that with code, depending on the option that I select. So let's put this in the resource group. Let's put this in that resource group. Let's say do test function, and just going to leave that as code. If I specify .NET, and if I go to next, you can see that that's Windows, so that could be Windows or Linux, right?
Right.
However, if I go and I say I want Docker to run it as Docker container, you can see that the Windows option is grayed out,
Yeah.
right? So it only supports containers for Linux at the moment. So in terms of the features that it has, so all the features that Azure App Service has, it has those features also, because again, it's an evolution of Azure App Service, right? So easy authentication, custom domains, SSL configuration, it supports all of those. So it has flexible deployment options. How do we deploy our code? If we're running a microservice as code, or sorry, development in this case, not deployment. So how do we develop? We can develop in the portal. So what that means is that if I go ahead and I create this Azure Function app and I create my function in that, I can just write my code in the portal, right? But most developers will probably not do that. They'll probably write it in Visual Studio Code or in Visual Studio or other tools. But the good thing is that Azure Function allows you to integrate these other tools directly, these IDEs directly with the service itself.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, yeah. So it makes it much more easier. So we have flexible deployment options also. So let's say developer, the workflow is developer codes and then pushes their code into source control. You can deploy from GitHub, from Azure repos, from Bitbucket, from just even like a Git repo that's on the developer system. You can deploy straight into Azure Functions from there. Or you can deploy using manual options like OneDrive or Dropbox, or just do FTP, copy your code, connect to Azure Function using FTP, copy your code into it and run it that way. So it supports that. So let's look at the hosting plans that Azure Function supports. So Azure Function supports 3 hosting plans. So again, Sarko, if you remember like our analogy on CCNA, where sometimes people say things and then few moments later they're like, that's not the full truth, right? There's actually more information here. So this is actually not the full truth. So Azure Function supports more than 3 hosting plan, but for our case, for the exam objectives, we only need to know about these 3, right? So there are other options. For example, you can host Azure Functions directly on Kubernetes, right? You can, so which is something called KEDA, right? So Kubernetes event-driven architecture. You can host it on Azure App Service environment. Other methods exist beyond these 3, but these 3 are the ones that has to do with the exam that we are preparing for. So there are 3 hosting plans. There's the consumption plan, there is a premium plan, and there's the dedicated plan. So let's start with the consumption plan first of all, Sir Coffee. Consumption plan of Azure App Service. So the consumption plan of Azure App Service is actually what people are referring to when they say serverless. This is the Azure Azure function mode that is called the serverless mode. I'll show that to you very quickly. So you see I'm over here on the screen, right, Sakofi?
Yeah.
It says, what plan do I want to use? If I go ahead and I try to, okay, let's go ahead and I switch that. So by the way, container doesn't support serverless. So that's why you see that serverless is grayed out.
Yeah.
Consumption is grayed out. So if I go ahead and switch that back to code and I leave that as .NET and I leave that as Central US and I go to next. So if I leave that, you can see that for the plan type, if I select consumption, that is also called serverless.
Yeah.
But the other ones, they are not necessarily called serverless, even though, function premium, I'll also consider that to be serverless to an extent, right? So, but anyways, you
So
have,
it doesn't mean that okay, yeah, you come to that anyway. Yeah,
oh
go on.
no, so carry on with your question, sir.
No, I was
Carry
just
on.
going to say, it doesn't mean that other services give you a bit leeway when it comes to managing the underneath resources, like the CPU
Yes,
and other stuff. Yeah.
exactly. And you're right, Sakofi. So for example, if I go to select function premium, you see that I have to define the backend plan,
Yeah.
similar to what we do for Azure App Service Plan, right? So now I have a bit more control on the backend, right?
Yeah.
With the other one, it's like forget about the backend. It's none of your business,
Understand.
right? So that's why it's called serverless,
Yeah.
right?
Before you continue, I got a question from Amit. He said, "Can we call Azure Function manually?"
Yes. So a good way to do that would be using the HTTP trigger. So when I set up Azure Function and I set it up with an HTTP trigger, one of the advantages that has is that it's going to give me an automatically generated HTTP endpoint. So anytime I want to call that function, I just need to send a request to that endpoint and it's going to cause my code to run, right? So that way, does that make sense? I hope that makes sense, Akofi.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, we can do that. Okay. So let's go back to this. So we have the plan. So let's quickly go through the plan. So we have the serverless plan. So you see that the serverless plan or the consumption plan is the one that we're talking about because we don't have to provision anything like we don't need to provision any compute in advance. We don't need to reserve anything in advance. You saw that earlier, Sakofi. When I
Yeah.
selected serverless, I don't need to reserve anything. But the good thing is that it has automatic scaling. So it's going to respond based on the event that's coming in. If there's 100,000 requests that comes in, right, from the trigger endpoint, it's going to add compute automatically to handle that. If the request goes away, then it's going to then it's going to shut down all the compute. So you're not reserving anything, but it can add compute as it needs, right? So that's what it's saying here. So it's scaled out when the load increases. When the load goes away, it goes back to 0. So that's the difference between this one. When there is nothing to service, it scales down to 0. For the other ones, it doesn't scale down to zero. For the premium plan, there's always one instance that's always running in the background. For this one, it's actually going to go down to zero if there is no request to process. So, but any downside that you can see, Sarkofi, with this setup of Azure of the consumption plan?
I mean, when you say it will go down to zero, I'm thinking about how long does it take for it to obviously spin up an instance when it needs to run a code.
That's a very, very good question, and that's the key there, right there, Sarkofi. So because of that, there is this issue called a cold start, right? So cold start is what you just described, Sarkofi. How long will it take? How long is it going to take for all this automatically adding an instance and doing all that? How long will it take for that to happen while the request is waiting? So
Yes,
for
right.
some organizations, they may go, that's not sufficient for us. What we actually need to put in place is we actually need to put in place an instance that's always warm. So you always have one warm instance that's running in the background. And that is where premium plan comes in. So with premium plan, you always have one instance that will be warm indefinitely, right?
Right.
But it also has other advantages. So, for example, with Premium Plan, you can integrate it with a virtual network in Azure to connect with your private virtual network resources. So you can't do that with the consumption plan, for example. Right, so we're talking about architectural stuff here. So with this one, you can integrate it with virtual networks in Azure, and it has other capabilities that it supports. With a dedicated plan, that is essentially saying, I want to run my Azure function on an Azure App Service plan. So, the same app service plan that we use for app service, you're like, I'm just going to use that to run my function. So those are the three main models that we have, right? So in terms of comparing them together, Sarkofi, very, very quickly, let's bring this up. So let's go and see. So let's go with this one. So for Azure Function, if you have a look at the consumption plan, you can see that you can only host your application as code. It doesn't support containers, right? But you can host it as code on Windows or Linux. If you're using the app service plan, you can host your microservice as code or as containers or Windows or Linux. So obviously, if you're going to be hosting it as containers, it doesn't support Windows, it's got to be Linux, right? So there's a lot of calculation to make. If
Yeah.
you're using premium plan, you can host as code as containers, Windows or Linux in the backend. But if you're hosting as premium plan container, it's just Linux at the moment. So just be aware that this is sort of like a combination of all of them. Okay, so another thing to mention, Sarkofi, is that when we're talking about Azure Function, we also have to specify something called a runtime version. So let me go ahead and create this function app that I was creating earlier. So I'll leave it as serverless. I'll go ahead and I will disable application insights. So let's set that to no. And I'll go ahead and create that. And let's go ahead and do this. So when that's finished creating, I'll come back to it, and then we're going to see, the function runtime versions that exist. So, but while we're thinking about that, let's talk about some architectural considerations for what we've discussed so far. So let's talk about scalability, for example, Sarkofi. So what should we be aware of from a scalability perspective? So now that we understand that Azure Function can be hosted in three different plans, so here's what the scalability maps out to be. So you can see that the scalability for, sorry, let's go ahead and erase all the inks, erase all of that. So you can see that we have the consumption plan, the premium plan, and the dedicated plan. For the consumption plan, even though you can, it's going to scale based on the event that comes in, you can only add up to 200 instances in the backend, right? So there is a limit, right?
Yeah.
So for the premium plan, premium plan, you're going to have one instance that's going to be warm, right? To make sure that you don't get that cold start. So because if this instance is warm, then what that means is that when the request comes in, This instance can keep processing requests
Yes,
while
right.
we automatically add
Spin up.
more instances to add that, but we can only go up to 100 instances in the backend, right? With dedicated plan, because that is tied to Azure App Service, Azure App Service scaling is typically between 10 and 20. So you can only have up to 10 to 20 instances in the backend. So this is sort of like the maximum number of instances that we can have. That depends on the plan that we select.
From your experience, has
Yeah,
there been any scenario whereby Azure Function services are down, or is there
it's
any
possible.
guarantee uptime or something like that?
It's definitely possible. So you're talking about like the SLA. So
SLA, something like that.
yeah, let me bring up like a nice document. Microsoft has this nice document, very very nice document that they've streamlined that essentially covers SLA in general for Azure. So there's an Azure SLA document, and essentially all you need to do is you just need to select. Let me bring that up on the screen. You just need to select the service that you're interested in, and it's going to show you the SLA for that service. So let's go for compute, and let's look for Azure Functions, and let's see. So function app on the consumption plan guarantee that the associated function will run 99.95% of the time after trigger is successfully fired. So that's the
All right.
SLA. So 99.95%. So let's go to the availability SLA calculator or SLA calculator. So there's a nice calculator here that we can use. So 99.95% is how much? So that means essentially it could be down for up to 21 minutes in a month for up to 4 hours in a year,
Well,
right? So, but that's in a whole year, so, and daily and stuff.
yeah.
So, but that's like, it's going to run up to that. So for function app running on app service plans, so the SLA for that is different. So actually it's also 99.95%
Yeah.
of the time also, right? So, and then, you can go into details.
But since you're not obviously in charge of the underlying resource, in
Hmm.
terms of where those instances are actually spin, like for example, it can be spin in different data centers, different regions. Is that the case?
Oh no! So because you actually, when I was creating this earlier, one of the things that I have to
Selected the
select is
region.
yeah, exactly, I have to select the region. So it's not going to spin up. So this was selected to be Central US, so it's going to spin that up. Yeah.
All right. So, but what about the data center? Does it spin up any of the data centers in central US, or do they? I mean,
Oh, okay. I see what you mean.
restricted? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So no. So under the hood, I'll guess that they'll probably be leveraging availability zones under the
Yeah.
hood to essentially for them to be able to meet this SLA, right?
Be
I'll
utilized.
probably assume that they're
Yeah.
spreading it across multiple data centers in that region. Okay,
I've got
so
a question here. Let me just follow
yes,
up
sir.
with this question real quick.
No problem, sir.
They may say which of the hosting plan is good for a high end operation.
Oh, high end operation. So, what do you mean by high end operation, Opeyemi? So, you have to define high end operation.
I'm just
So, if you,
assuming it might
yeah,
be services that are highly utilized. So if let's say you have maybe 100,000 customers,
hmm,
obviously all of them accessing the same resource or something like that.
yep.
That'll be high probably in operation, I'm guessing.
So that's where the architectural component that we are describing comes into place, Kofi. Because if you think about it, right? So, okay, let's have a look at like what we have here, right? If you have a look at this, for consumption plan, you can have up to 200 instances in the backend, right? For premium plan, you can have up to 100 instances. Let's go to the next slide very quickly. If you go to the next slide, you can see that for the consumption plan, the memory per instance is 1.5. So essentially, you have to go 1.5 times 200, right? So that's the maximum amount of memory that can be available for your code to run at the end, even if it gets to the limit, that's the limit, right?
Yeah.
Right. And that's, 200 instances times 1.5. And that's essentially 300, if I'm correct, right? So that's essentially like 300 gigabytes of memory that's available and all that stuff. So then you have to calculate essentially, does this number one meet the peak that you expect your application to get to, right? Does this meet the peak? So you have to essentially make that calculation. So it depends, right?
'Cause I think at the end of the day, it's all about if your service is high demand, then
Mm.
you need to get the premium or you have to get a dedicated plan.
Yeah.
Obviously,
So
that will cost you more money.
no, but it depends, right? So because consumption also has its own advantage, right?
Right.
So for example, like premium has the advantage that you have one instance that's always warm. You have all these other capabilities. So actually, Sakofi, to agree with you, Microsoft actually does push premium. They're trying to encourage people to use premium more, right? Because initially, what the way they're positioning it is sort of like the best of both worlds. You
Yeah.
get let me go ahead and bring up this document very quickly for you, Sakofi. So you see some of the capabilities that premium has that the consumption plan does not have. So let me go ahead and bring this up very, very quickly. Let's see the premium. Um, let's see premium plan. Okay, so let me go ahead and bring this up on the screen so we can see the sort of capabilities that premium has. So, for example, you avoid, that cold start issue,
Mhm.
right? With one instance, you have virtual network connectivity, you have unlimited execution duration. We'll talk about this in a minute. Um, you have variance in terms of the sizes that you can select. You have more predictable pricing. That is a very nice marketing. That
Yeah.
is nice marketing, Sakofi.
Predictable.
Predictable pricing.
No
But
surprises.
as part of that predictability, because one of the things with consumption is you only pay when your code is actually running, right? If my code is not running, I'm paying for zero,
Yeah.
right? But for premium, I'm paying for that one instance, whether my actually let me go ahead and bring up the slide for pricing and that I was going to show you anyways. So let me go ahead and bring that up. For consumption, you're paying based on the actual execution, right? That's what you're paying for. I'll talk about this later. But for premium, you're paying based on allocation, not consumption, right? So
Okay.
with this one, you're paying only when you're actually using CPU and memory. Otherwise, you're paying for zero. For this one, you're paying for that one instance that you provisioned, you pay for that. And then as more instances are allocated, you pay for that, regardless of whether you're using the full compute power or not.
All
Does
right.
that make sense? So, but
Yeah.
that is, what marketing calls predictable pricing. It sounds nice, right? It sounds better that way.
Yeah.
It sounds better to say predictable price. But Sarkofi, I think that we should use that a bit more. That's a very nice way, right? Yeah.
Think they are very careful with the type of words they use. Obviously, these are all marketing tactics.
Predictable pricing means that you're paying for it whether you're using it or not. That's part of the meaning, right? And all these nice marketing terms. But anyways, that's sort of like what that. So essentially, consumption also has an advantage that you're paying for zero when you're not running anything. So it really all depends on many things, not just based on the warm time and other stuff. But let's talk about other parts that has to do with scalability because we're talking about architecture. How many functions can we have in a function app? We can have up to 100 for consumption, up to 100 for premium. Unbounded, which means essentially no set limits by Microsoft for dedicated plan, but you're still limited by the number of resources that's available to you, right? So still that. So still on scalability, let's talk about this. There is this thing called timeout that you need to be careful about. And if you're planning to take the exam, I recommend that you understand this concept very quickly, right? Sorry, very critically. So, what timeout means, Coffee, is that so I have my function, right? So here's my code that I've defined, and I have a trigger that I've defined to run, right? So maybe I have an HTTP trigger. Whenever there's an HTTP request that comes in, my code is going to run and then it's going to output results back, maybe as an HTTP response also back to the person that called the HTTP. So that's what my function does. If whenever the HTTP is running, if my HTTP request is going to take 10 minutes to process before it finishes the processing, before it can send the response, I cannot use the consumption plan for that, because consumption plan expects your processing to finish within 5 minutes.
Right.
Otherwise, that's it. It's just gonna go. You've not finished in 5 minutes. Boom. We're cutting that. We're cutting that. We're stopping that.
That,
However, yeah. Sorry, carry on, Sakofi.
I was just going to say that seems to be another way to push people to use premium or other service.
Maybe one way to put it like that, but also another way to put it, Sir Kofi, is that it helps you to define what is this service for. This is not a service for running monolithic application.
Okay.
This is not a service for running long running application, right? It's like, like when when you're driving a car, you've seen some of those roads where they will have a height limit,
Yeah.
where they will say, you cannot, if you're a trailer or a huge truck, you can't drive on this road, right?
Yeah.
Essentially to cut it down to let you know, hey, the use for this one is not for truck. If you want to go drive on the main road, not on this type of small roads. So that's essentially what's going on here, is to say you're not going to be running monolithic applications where it's going to be dragging, and it's going to be taking minutes to finish one process. Within 5 minutes, if you're running a microservice, it should have finished processing. However, everything is always not the full truth. There is an option to use something called durable functions in Azure. It's something that you're familiar with, Sakofi, if you had us talk about before,
Oh,
with
no.
durable functions. So there's something called Azure Durable Function. And what Azure Durable Function does is that it allows us to run long-running operations in a serverless or stateless environment like Azure Function. Right. So, even though we have all this limitation, there's always like ways around them. That's part of our role as architects, is to know all these different options. Right. So just be aware of that. So the consumption plan has a default timeout limit of 5 minutes, which means your code should finish running in 5 minutes. Otherwise, it's going to time out. You can increase that to 10 minutes by modifying something called the host.json file of the Azure function. So every Azure function that you create has a configuration file called host.json, and that file, you can use it to control some of the behavior of the backend. So for example, if I go to my function app that I created just now, so here's my function app. If I go on the functions, there's really nothing that's showing up in terms of function here. So, but let's go to use development tools. Let's go to advanced tools. Let's go to the Kudu console. So you can see that this looks like Azure App Service, right? You look at everything, looks like Azure App Service over here. So because it's an evolution of Azure App Service. So if I go to the backend, and you can see the JSON file. So there are multiple ways that we can use to access the JSON file, Sakofi. So we can access it using the method that I'm using now, or you can also access it using other option. So if I go over here, let's go to CMD. Right? And if I go to CMD, if I go to sites, if I go to www root, you can see also JSON file there.
Yeah.
And if I go to edit that, so you can see what this looks like. However, if I wanted to modify what that configuration is, if I do Azure Function host JSON, so it's a configuration file. And the function, no, I don't want you to take my data, Microsoft. So, so if I go to host.json file, and you see that one of the options that we can use this file to configure is the timeout. So, why is it taking a long time to open? Oh, okay, here we go. So if I scroll down, you can see I have function timeout, and I can use that to increase it. So essentially, I can go add this configuration. So the default is 5 minutes anyway, but I can go add that and essentially increase it to 10 minutes for the consumption plan. Does that make sense, Akofi? Make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but let's talk about the others, because the others also are important. So we have the premium plan, which has a default timeout of 30 minutes, but you can essentially set it to unbounded by setting it to 0, and then that's going to essentially have no limit, right? You have dedicated plan that's going to be, 30 by default, but you can also set it to unbounded, and then it's going to be unlimited. So this is also like an important thing. with the consumption plan, Sir Coffee, is that this is also a protection mechanism for you, right? This default timeout not going beyond 10 minutes. It's a protection plan for you. So what do I mean by protection plan? So imagine a situation where a request comes in. Now I'm paying for when my code is running, right? I'm using the compute, right?
Yeah.
So now imagine that my code has as sort of like an exception that just causing it to go in circles, right? And it just keeps going for like 5,000 minutes. It's not processing anything that's adding value to my business. All that it's doing is it's just consuming compute. So in order to prevent that, it's good for it to time out, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So because otherwise it's just going to be going in a loop and just consuming compute. And Microsoft, so essentially after 10 minutes, if it's not finished processing, it's going to time it out. It's got to start again. So the other point to note, also this is important if you're planning to do the exam, is the maximum outbound connection per instance, right? So let's say your function is going to be making outbound connections to other services. There is a limit if you're using the consumption plan. The limit is 600 active, which and 1,200 in total. In other words, 600 outbound connections in terms of the sessions that it's setting up is the limit that you have for that, because this is also important, right? So let me see if I can have like a sample question to test people's knowledge in this area. I think that I used to have one that I created. Let me see. Let me see that. Let me see if I have this question here. Oh, okay. So have a look at this question, Sakofi. Have a look at this question. So you are developing an Azure function that connects to an Azure SQL database instance. The function is going to be triggered by an Azure storage queue. So whenever there's a new queue message, it's going to trigger the function. You're receiving numerous reports about system invalid operation exception with the following message: timeout expired. Now we understand what timeout means, right?
Yeah.
So the timeout period elapsed prior to obtaining a connection from the pool. So essentially you have two concepts now: the timeout, which is the time of processing, and the connection, which is the network connection, right? So it's saying the timeout period elapsed prior to obtaining a connection from the pool. This may have occurred because all pooled connections were in use and maximum pool size was reached. You need to prevent this exception. What should you do? And it gave 4 options over there, right? Now, from what we know, what would you recommend, Sakofi, for the
Let's
audience
see.
also?
Where the trigger to was about the time of product.
And I'll give like a pointer. So remember the differences between the timeout and the connections that's supported by the different plans. Remember that.
Well, I'm leaning towards C.
Leaning towards C. So let's
Azure
see
Function
that.
the premium plan.
And Sarkov is correct. It is
Yeah.
C. So, but again, the reason why you were able to answer that question is because you know that there is a difference in the limits that exist, right,
Yeah.
between the timeout and the outbound connection, the outbound connection limits for consumption, premium, and dedicated plan. So that helped you to answer that question right there. So this slide is very important if you're planning to take the exam. Make sure you understand that. Okay. So I'm looking at the time here. We only have like about 4 more minutes. So let me just talk about a few more things, and then we'll stop for this one. So let's talk about pricing of Azure Function. So everything in Azure Function, it's not like absolute like that. It always depends on which plan are you using, right? It varies. So that's why it's only a few situations that you just go this one. It always varies. So pricing for consumption plan is based on the execution, the memory that you're consuming, right? So if your function runs for longer, it's going to cost you more. If your function consumes more memory, it's going to cost you more. So here's an example. So let's say a function is going to consume 0.5 gigs of memory for 3 seconds. Azure function cost essentially will be execution cost, which will be the number of memory used by the amount of time that the function is running. So that's the what will lead to the cost, and that will equal to 1.5 GB per second. So that's the reason why if you go for Azure Function pricing, for the consumption plan, you notice that it's specified in Giga Azure Function pricing. Yeah, you notice that. Oh my God! Look at wow. This is bad, Sakofi. I won't say much more than that. Actually, I should probably say more than that. Bing has a better, sorry, yeah, Google has a better search for Microsoft documents than Bing does.
Google it himself.
It's, apologies, Microsoft, if you're watching, but this is sad. Fix it. you know, if I go for Azure Function pricing, Google brings up exactly the pricing page instantly, right? It's at the top of the stuff. So that's sad, Microsoft. That's sad, really, really sad. Okay, anyways, Sakofi, let me go ahead and bring this up. So you can see that for the consumption plan, you can see how the pricing is structured. You can see that it's structured at per gigabyte per second, right?
Yeah.
So what does that mean? So what that means is what we just explained, which means it's going to charge you for the amount of memory that your code is using and for the number of seconds that it's running. So that's what that's based on, right? So essentially, if you just know these two, if a function runs for longer, it's going to cost you more because that number will increase the 3 seconds. If a function consumes more memory, it's going to cost you more because that number is going to increase. So billing is going to be aggregated across all function in the function app. So the first 400,000 gigabyte per second is free. The first 1 million executions are free. So that's how that works.
1 million
So
executions.
yeah, so you see here, you see that there's a free
Yeah.
allocation here, over here. So that's free. And by the way, here's a funny thing, Sakofi. This is exactly the same thing for
You know.
AWS Lambda. If you go for AWS Lambda pricing, they both give exactly the same free tier. It's like people were looking at each other when they gave the free tier. If you have a look at AWS Lambda pricing, can you see the free tier that they have? Where is the free tier listed? Where is your free tier, AWS? Where are you hiding it? Oh, here we go. So you can see 1 million free requests, that's the execution, and 400,000 GB per second per month
Yeah.
is free. So it's exactly the same thing that they have over here.
They just want to make sure there's no advantage. I think people might take advantage of. I mean, at the end of the day, these guys know what they're doing.
Yep. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Oh, I can see that we have some answers from Okoyemi and Amit.
Yeah.
So yeah, use premium plan. So Amit is right. So Okoyemi, the answer is the premium plan. So once you know the differences, you'll be able to answer those type of questions. So Okoyemi said, so like healthcare or transportation operation.
Yeah. So that's
So
the high end operation, the question that you answered earlier.
yeah, so like which hosting plan is good for healthcare or transportation operation? Um, I'll say like it depends because I'm not sure like the application that the healthcare is using. I'll say it could be any. So the main thing to note here, Opeyemi, is that Microsoft are advising the premium plan because it's sort of like the best of both worlds. However, be aware that with the premium plan, you're going to be paying because it's not as if the premium plan is using, some compute that's not available to the consumption plan. So they all have like similar capabilities, apart from the premium plan being able to connect to private network resources, right? So apart from that, capabilities are typically similar across all of them. However, for the premium plan, you're paying for an instance, whether you're using it or not. For the consumption plan, you're paying for zero, but then you could get some cold start at the beginning, with stuff. So that's what really matters when determining which one to use. For the premium plan, we already mentioned you're going to be charged based on what is allocated, not based on what you're using or consuming. For the dedicated plan, you're going to be paying for your app service the same way you pay for your app service plan anyway. So that's sort of like how that is structured. So hopefully this gives us some, architectural components of Azure App Service. Hopefully it's good information. So we'll take any questions if there's any questions. If not, please do not forget to share this,
Right.
like the video, subscribe to the channel. Make sure you share this with others. Let others see, so they can also join. So next week we're going to be looking at Azure Storage, and I believe that we have Promise, which volunteered to take that. So Promise will be taking that session, and then we're going to look at databases, and then hopefully we'll bring this series to a close, and then we'll see how we go from there.
All right. That's wonderful. Thank you, Sir David. And I'm glad that you guys join in as well. We hope to see you guys next week. So, as always, have a wonderful evening, morning, or afternoon. You never know. All right.
Yeah.
Bye.
See everyone. Bye bye.